Welcome. Welcome everybody to the Norfolk Historical Society, our third webinar. I'm Peggy McPhillips. I'm the president of Norfolk Historical Society. This is our March webinar. It's our third one. Tonight's topic is Style and Flair, Selections from the Wardrobe of Florence K. Sloane. Couple of housekeeping notes. You will notice somewhere on your screen a chat or a Q&A link. Please feel free to type in any questions or comments anytime during the presentation. We will address them at the end of the program. Also, we are recording the presentation and we will make that as well as previous webinars available on our website. And our Norfolk Historical website is www.norfolkhistorical.org. That's all lowercase, all run together, norfolkhistorical.org. And now it is my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Lindsay Neal, Curator of Collections at the Hermitage Museum and Gardens since 2014. Ms. Neal received her MA in Art History from the University of Cincinnati in 2012 and spent a brief time in Charleston, South Carolina before moving to Norfolk in 2013 as the spouse of an active duty Navy sailor. She's one of the many, many good things that the Navy has brought to Norfolk, and we are so glad. The Navy brought her to Norfolk, and her interest in Japanese art and her love of historic homes of the arts and crafts period brought her to the Hermitage, which was originally the home of William and Florence Sloane. Lindsay now manages the museum's permanent collection, which includes a variety of Asian, American, and European fine and decorative art. The museum also maintains many objects and materials left to the organization after Mrs. Sloane's death in 1953. These include textiles, objects of material culture, items of personal use, things that were used and owned by the Sloane family during their lifetime. That personal collection formed the basis for the Winter-Spring 2020 exhibition, Style and Flair, Selections from the Wardrobe of Florence K. Sloane. Unfortunately, the exhibition was cut short in March by COVID-19, but this evening we are treated to a reprise of the exhibition personally narrated by Ms. Neal just in time for Women's History Month. So I hope you will all join me in welcoming Lindsay Neal to our webinar this evening. Lindsay, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Peggy. That was such a sweet introduction. I appreciate it. It's wonderful to be here. It's really such an honor to be part of this evening. I'm going to share my screen really quickly and put this away. Hide that. Throughout the presentation, you'll see me for just a few minutes, but I'm actually going to push my video portion to the side just so you can see the slides a little bit better. But anyway, it's great to be here. Thank you all so much for tuning in. As Peggy mentioned, it is Women's History Month this month, so it's always a pleasure to speak a little bit about Florence Sloane's impact in the city of Norfolk and really focus on some of the highlights of her trailblazing accomplishments throughout her lifetime. And as Peggy mentioned, the basis of some of her personal objects in our collection formed the basis and inspiration for an exhibition that I put together last year. And so tonight's talk is going to be a virtual tour, essentially, of that exhibition. And I'm really pleased to be able to offer this simply because it was only open for about a month last year before we had to make the hard decision to close because of COVID. And so I know there were many people in Norfolk who didn't get a chance to see the exhibition. So I hope that this will enable you to feel like you've been through the exhibit a little bit. So I'm going to minimize my video here and put myself off to the side. And I'm going to back up quite a bit here. Okay, so as Peggy mentioned, the Hermitage Museum and Gardens was founded by Norfolk Sloane family. And the brains behind their art collection and the design of their incredible home and gardens was due to the visionary efforts of Mrs. Florence Sloane. Style and Flair offered a rare glimpse of the personal clothing and accessories in the museum's collection that were either worn by or collected by its founder, Florence Sloane. During the planning stages leading up to this exhibit, I knew that I wanted to do something for 2020 that would focus on this personal side of her story because she was an exceptional female leader in Norfolk throughout her lifetime. It's one thing to learn about a person through written records such as correspondence, but it's another to see the materials that they owned and even the ones that they actually wore. Her clothing collection seemed like a wonderful and intimate way to share her story with our visitors. This exhibition was the first that focused on these unique garments from the textile collection. And for many of the items, this was the first time they had been on view in decades. So that's always a lot of fun for me personally to be able to bring things from object storage out onto view. Through these garments, which we eventually paired with several accessories, we highlighted how vibrant and unique Florence Sloane's own sense of fashion was, particularly during the 1920s and 30s. Although we were also able to share a couple of examples from the turn of the 20th century and one wonderful example from 1946, which I'll show you later. Before we get into the exhibition, I wanted to spend a little bit of time kind of orienting us to who Florence Sloane was. If you're not from Norfolk or you're not terribly familiar with who she was an exceptional woman and she had a lot of major accomplishments throughout her lifetime. Florence grew up in the end of the Victorian era and was married at just 19 years old, just before the turn of the 20th century. And throughout her lifetime, she witnessed major innovations and advances, world wars, social and economic highs, and extreme lows. She was part of a generation of new, modern women whose roles and influences changed in dramatic and important ways during this age in American history. And so in the next few slides, I'll offer a clearer picture of who she was and what she involved herself with throughout her years. Florence was born in New York City in 1873, and she was the youngest of 5 children. She remained close to her older sisters, Grace and Emma, throughout her lifetime. Her father was a middle-class merchant who was active in the carpet industry. His family had been established in New York City since 1630s. Her mother was from an old upper middle class family from New York City that had also been established in the area since the 1630s. In a letter that she wrote to a friend in 1950, Florence recalled some of her earlier years. I was born in Greenwich Village. My mother always told me of going to the opera at Castle Garden and also about riding in Battery Park in a long blue riding habit with plumes on her hat. So being told about all of these fascinating things about my forebears, I was particularly happy to be brought here as a bride to this lovely old-fashioned town, Norfolk. Florence came to Norfolk in 1893, shortly after her marriage to Mr. William Sloane. In the early 20th century, Norfolk was not known as the cultural town that it is today. And in fact, it was viewed less than favorably by several newspapers. According to an article from New York's Town magazine in 1900, it was the wickedest city in America. I think that was an exaggeration. But for many years, it was generally depicted as a gritty wharf town. However, it was strategically located and eventually made its mark because it had ports along important waterways and it had emerging industries. William eventually owned and operated several knitting mills in the area, which was quite a lucrative business at the time. So Florence came to Norfolk with this perception that it was a bit old-fashioned at first, and that really appealed to her. By 1895, she and William had a home built for themselves in Berkeley, which today is considered a part of South Norfolk. And by the way, their first home still stands. From the beginning of her time in Norfolk, she seems to have spent a lot of time with family, her in-laws, and several of the dogs that they owned, as you see in the image on the right-hand side in this slide. It seems that there was not much already in Norfolk at the time to occupy her culturally. But we do have reason to believe that at the least, she did involve herself in china painting classes where she would have met other women And this would have been between the time that she arrived in the 1890s and sometime in the early 1900s. So she made a few friends in this time. She made the acquaintance of an art teacher whose name was Belle Irvine, and these two became lifelong friends. And eventually, they both became involved in the Norfolk Society of Arts when it was later established. Florence also seems to have spent much of her free time dabbling with sewing and china painting projects, a pastime that would have been very common for women of her generation. She also remained very close to her family back in New York City and traveled to and from there for occasional visits. In 1903, after 10 years of marriage to William Sloane, Florence gave birth to their first child, William Jr., and in 1906, their second child, Edwin Knapp. She appears to have been a devoted and engaged mother to her two sons throughout their lifetime. By 1907, William and Florence purchased land in what was then known as Tanner's Creek. It was essentially the country of Norfolk. Until this time, it was only accessible by boat and definitely considered to be undesirable marshland. It hadn't been developed as a residential area that it is today until 1907, when the Jamestown Exposition took place in Norfolk. Today, that is where the Norfolk Naval Base is located. And so the Hermitage, as they called what they began to build as their summer home on this abandoned property that was just marshland in 1907, began as the Sloane family's private summer home. It was a waterfront cottage, far removed from the hustle and bustle of the city. Florence's time was spent not only furnishing and designing what she wanted for the summer home that they had built, but she was also meeting and engaging with new people in the area. Until 1917, the land that was used for the Jamestown Exposition was largely abandoned until World War I, when the US military established the naval base there. Not many private citizens in Norfolk took too kindly to the sudden influx of sailors in the small city. And there was also very little to keep servicemen who were stationed here entertained in quote unquote wholesome ways. There were some usual options. There were bars and gambling. But Florence was one of the few Norfolk citizens who set out to create moral outlets of recreation for these US sailors. She involved herself pretty heavily with the American Red Cross organization and several recreation clubs dedicated to servicemen. She invited military men to her family's estate on several occasions for large lawn parties and entertainment, as you see here in the upper right-hand corner of this slide. They're playing lawn games, which look a little dangerous actually, and we probably wouldn't play those today. And she even maintained correspondence with several sailors throughout their years of service. During the war years, the Sloanes involved themselves heavily with charitable organizations. They made donations to Norfolk General Hospital and the Marine Hospital in Berkeley. Florence herself served as a volunteer postmaster during the war, and she completed certification in hygiene and first aid to be able to assist servicemen even better. She was also in frequent communication with the American Red Cross because she and William donated a residential property that was located in the Algonquin Park neighborhood to be used as a convalescent home for servicemen to recover during the war. This was called Camp Sloane. Additionally, the Sloanes also donated their own private boat named the USS Caprice to be used by the Navy to patrol waters for enemy ships. The Caprice, which is shown here in the lower right corner, had a small crew of sailors on board, and Florence actually sent them care packages that often included Coca-Cola and letters to lift their morale. By 1917, two of Florence's close friends are an artist named Douglas Volk and the local educator, Belle Irvine, suggested to the Irene Leach Memorial Association, which was a group of women who were interested in furthering the art and cultural life in Norfolk, that they reconsider the terms of their membership of that organization. They suggested that instead of just alumni who had attended a girls' school in the turn of the 20th century, that they open the membership up to anyone who was interested. They also suggested that the name of the organization change to reflect this more inclusive nature. And so the Norfolk Society of Arts changed their name and their membership restrictions. And Florence was among the first non-school alumni to join when they made those changes. From this point on, Florence Sloane would offer the Norfolk Society of Arts support in a way that would enable the group to evolve into a thriving community arts organization. And this ultimately led to the establishment of a Norfolk Museum. When Florence became involved with the Norfolk Society, she chaired the Ways and Means Committee and hosted events at her home, the Hermitage, to raise money for the cause and to finally give the Norfolk Society a place to house their growing art collection. So in addition to all the work that she had done with the local military and all of her involvement with the Norfolk Society, the Sloanes also owned property in the Hague neighborhood. And on the corner of Mowbray Arch and Fairfax Avenue, they had a building built. And Florence worked directly with the architects to determine the aesthetic of the home. And there's a photograph of the exterior of the home here. It was a decidedly English Tudor cottage, go figure. If you're familiar with the Hermitage structure already, you might see a lot of similarities there. She also had a tremendous say in how it was decorated, and this is very typical, it seems, of Florence. But the structure was to be built for a dual purpose. It was supposed to be the recreation home for the United Service Club for enlisted servicemen, and it was also where the Norfolk Society of Arts was allowed to store their growing art collection in exchange for them helping out with the United Service Club for enlisted men. So by the 1920s, Florence was actively involved in establishing a local museum together with the Norfolk Society of Arts, and she was becoming an avid art collector. For the Norfolk Society of Arts, she served as an art scout. She traveled to and from New York City, where she could scope out galleries and leading contemporary artists of the time. Many of them had studios there or were involved with the National Academy of Design. And she was also cultivating genuine friendships with these people and became good friends with several female artists, which she eventually featured here in Norfolk for an exhibition in 1926. Perhaps most importantly, Florence managed to get city officials on board with the Norfolk Society of Arts plan. This was a major accomplishment and involved, in her words, no longer waiting around for the city. At the time, it was unheard of for city governments to be involved with, let alone help fund arts and cultural efforts. So Florence was very serious about museums, and she was very serious about establishing a cultural community together with the Norfolk Society of Arts in Norfolk. And she made this her business for nearly 28 years of her life. But she also made time for fun as well. In the 1920s, her sons went abroad for college. They attended Oxford University, and while they spent several years there, Florence took this as an opportunity to travel throughout many areas of Europe. She based herself in London with an apartment, and she was able to explore additional areas of England, Italy, Spain, France, Holland, just to name a few. In this time, she saw so many parts of the world she had never seen before. She could take in beautiful architecture and landscapes and gardens that surrounded her. She experienced a variety of food and different cultures. She met art and antiques dealers, and she brought many of these inspirations back with her because she recorded these in a travel journal, and she implemented these designs into her own home and gardens at the Hermitage. Also in our archives is evidence of Florence's more playful spirit and creative energy. She would often put together playful little poems for those that she wrote to, often about silly or mundane things. This one, for instance, is a thank you poem for a recent birthday party, and it includes much affection for a dog, and the pictures of which are on the far right-hand side here. She loved dogs. It's purported that she had something like 11 dogs in her lifetime, and she loved all breeds of dogs. There were German Shepherds around the Hermitage grounds, Wolfhounds, terriers, and all sorts of mutts as well. So her witty, playful spirit and sense of humor is preserved, and this is just one of many examples of this. Florence was truly an extraordinary woman in her lifetime, and there would be many words to describe her. I could spend an hour just talking about how wonderful she seems to have been and all the amazing accomplishments that she made in her lifetime. But I do want to spend some time of this presentation talking about the exhibition. So I won't go into that too much. But she was truly a tireless leader for the community, and I can't stress that enough. And for this, she was officially recognized for all of her achievements and service to the city of Norfolk in 1933. That year, she was awarded Norfolk's first Citizen Award from the city's Cosmopolitan Club. And she was the first woman in Norfolk to be presented with this honor, which was a tremendous accomplishment. Since 1928, this group had presented the award to those who have supported and worked to better the community in Norfolk. The nomination committee had numerous reasons for Florence Sloane's nomination in 1932. But they specifically cited her leadership and efforts in helping to establish the Norfolk Museum of Arts and Sciences. And that museum officially opened to the public just a few months later in 1933. Interestingly, she remained its first unpaid director until 1945. And just to also point out the time frame here, she had established the Hermitage Foundation, which was where her private art collection was housed. And she and her husband established that as a nonprofit in 1937. So she was essentially director of two museums between 1937 and 1945, which is just incredible. When she passed on March 31st, 1953, Florence left everything remaining in the home to the Hermitage Foundation. This, of course, resulted in the fine and decorative art collections that we have, objects from cultures all around the world, because she worked with art dealers for collecting a private art collection of her own. But it also left us with a lot of the personal effects that remain in our collection as well. So her legacy lives on in nearly every aspect of the Hermitage Museum and Gardens. A close friend of hers, Leila Hine, who worked alongside her both at the Norfolk Museum and the Hermitage, recalled that Florence had the ability to open new fields of knowledge and interest to others. She possessed strength and perseverance when working toward a goal, and last but not least, had enthusiasm for the project at hand. As she says, this last attitude makes the job, no matter what, enjoyable to those working with her. And so in considering all that we knew about Florence from old photos, articles, and letters, I began to try to piece together a visual timeline and consider how we could highlight how extraordinary, unique, and multifaceted this female leader was through a major collection that we had that just hadn't been fully realized yet, and that was our textile collection. At first, I turned to photographs to see how she styled herself through the decades, to see if there were any clues that I could look to from photographs. Although it was an interesting progression, as you see in this slide here, dating from about 1904 all the way up until nearly her death in the early 50s, the photographs were in black and white, and they featured a lot of casual garments. And unfortunately, the casual garments that she seems to be wearing in most of these photographs are just not part of our current textile collection. We're not quite sure where they might have gone to. So next, I turned to a number of oil paintings that depicted Florence Sloane that are part of the Hermitage Permanent Collection. And one of these, the one here on the right-hand side, is a portrait of Florence Sloane by her artist friend, Douglas Volk, in 1924. And just remember the outfit that she's wearing in this one. I just want to make a note of that. Now, for the paintings that we have of Florence Sloane, again, she is dressed in these beautiful garments in the paintings, but unfortunately, we just didn't see anything that matched these in the current textile collection that we have. And as I mentioned before, this was the first clothing exhibit for the Hermitage and me as well. And we did have an interesting assortment of garments that I knew that I wanted to show. And we had a lot to work with. And so we did set about to put together a costume exhibit, even though we had never done anything like this before. Among the many things that I learned throughout the process is that mounting an exhibition of clothing is a lot different than a usual approach of showing visual arts like paintings and sculptures. It was a very interesting and extremely satisfying challenge to work through, especially with the help of many individuals involved in the project. It truly took a village to accomplish, and I have the utmost respect and appreciation for anyone who works with costume exhibits. Prior to this exhibit, I had no way to adequately display the garments. We did not have a fleet of dressing forms to use for the garments. So I sent out a desperate plea to all of my regional colleagues in the area, and thankfully I was able to borrow 8 dressing forms from 3 different local organizations. So thank you, Hill House Museum in Portsmouth, thank you, Suffolk Arts League, and thank you to the Valentine Museum as well. I was able to rent the rest so that we could feature over 20 dresses. And once I had borrowed and rented the forms and had them on site, I then had to learn how to dress the forms. One of the things that I learned along the way was that even if you put a dress on a dressing form, it doesn't necessarily mean that it looks the best that it can look in terms of the fashion or the body that it's supposed to fit. So dressing the forms takes about 4 to 6 hours per dress, and we had over 20 dresses to install. Each installation was customized to the individual garment, meaning that if it needed more structure or it needed the illusion of a body or a form underneath, we had to add a variety of batting material and other archival safe materials to essentially recreate the shape of Florence. We were also trying to balance what we knew about Florence's body shape with the garments that came from different decades and the different fashion trends and changes that happened throughout the decades. So, to accomplish this, my wonderful colleague Jennifer Lucy and I had the opportunity to learn from a costume exhibit specialist from Richmond for a couple of days. After learning from her, we worked for about a full month to dress all of the forms. The final stage before the opening last year was to take the extra step of having the garments professionally photographed. Since this was our first clothing exhibit and there is so much stress put on garments in order to get them ready for exhibition, we knew that we needed to take every opportunity to visually document and record them in this exhibit ready state. This included things like steaming them before the photos and before putting them on view, which takes a toll on the garments themselves. We worked with a local photographer named Tom Norris in a couple of days leading up to the exhibition opening. And in light of having to unfortunately close the exhibit early last year, we are so glad that we did this because now we have visual record of the installations and the individual garments that we can share for many years now. Throughout the process, I looked at the garments that we did still have in our collection, and I really wanted them to help me tell the story of Florence Sloane through these personal objects. And what became clear to me was that she drew on many sources of inspiration. Just as she seemed to customize her home, the Hermitage, her personal belongings were also often customized and a reflection of her specific and eclectic tastes. So, how did we set about to bring this woman of such vision and fierce leadership to the forefront of the exhibition? Well, I'm actually going to show this photograph again because it served as a really important starting point for us. As I mentioned when I first showed this image, the photograph documents a very important event in Florence's life. This is the awards banquet held on January 26, 1933, to honor her as the first female to receive Norfolk's first Citizen Award. Here, Florence Sloane is seen in the middle of four gentlemen who were recipients of previous award years. And she certainly stands out here. Not only is she the only female in this picture, but she's pretty small in stature. She is apparently only 4'11". And I also want to point out that this is a black and white photograph. So looking at what she's wearing in this was, in comparing it to what she actually wore, it was actually kind of shocking. I was not expecting it at all. It was quite a shock to realize that she wore one of the brightest and most vibrant pieces in the whole collection for this occasion. And it was this captivating pink chiffon sleeveless evening gown from the 1930s that features bright beaded decoration of bows and ribbons. It's quite a stark comparison to the black and white photos that document this event. And at the time of the ceremony, Florence Sloane was 59 years old. More conventional women of the early 1930s, such as maybe First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, for instance, were wearing full gowns that often covered the shoulders and the necklines completely. So this piece is quite a youthful and vibrant wardrobe choice for such a ceremonial black tie event. And I think that it really epitomizes Florence's unique personal flair and individual sense of style. And this is a trend that's reflected in many of the other garments that are I'm going to show that are featured in the exhibition. Now, this was the only photograph that we had that actually matched a piece from our current textile collection. And so it was very important for that reason. And as I mentioned, the image was really a starting point for us because from this, we were able to essentially recreate the shape of Florence based on this photograph and what we knew about where her bust was, where her hips were, how wide her hips might have been, how petite her shoulders were, for instance. And really translate this into the dresses from the 1930s, and then also make some assumptions or guesses for the garments from the 1920s. This piece was also such a bold statement piece and worn on such an important occasion that it seemed like it needed to be front and center for the exhibition. And so that's exactly where I put it. I put it right when you walk into the museum, so it was the first garment that you saw when you visited during the exhibition. The rest of the exhibition featured garments that were strategically staged throughout the entire museum, both the historic interiors downstairs, where our permanent collection usually is, and the upstairs gallery spaces. My approach to the downstairs was to make use of these gorgeous original interiors and use them as the setting for these staged items. In a way, I wanted to use the garments in the space and create sort of activated areas. I wanted to use the original settings, and to do additional work, I pulled additional objects from object storage to create little vignettes. So for instance, I ended up pulling things like opera programs, silverware, sewing materials, and personal vanity items to complete a staged area. Having these examples of material culture and these highly personal objects that Florence owned in connection with the garments in each space, it feels like she really came to life. And to do this, I considered how each of the spaces was originally used by Florence and her family, and what themes or hobbies or special interests, what facets of Florence Sloane I could really highlight in each of the different spaces to give visitors a feeling that they were maybe seeing this personal, intimate side of her in the setting of her own home. So the exhibition started with that bright pink cosmopolitan dress. And from there, the exhibition drew you into the adjacent Gothic drawing room, or as it's also called, the music room. As you see in this image, the room is a feast for the eyes as far as its incredible Gothic Revival wood carvings and interior style. But the room functioned for the family as a withdrawing room, and they would often spend leisure time here or gathering together to enjoy music. There are two wonderful instruments usually on view in this room. In the foreground, you'll see a 1914 Steinway grand piano. And behind it, which you can't really see in the photograph, is a 1935 Moeller player pipe organ console. And the pipes to this are actually located in a closet in the upstairs level. Because this was the music room, I wanted to highlight Florence's lifelong love of music here. And to do this, I used a couple of garments, one of which is this incredible opera cape. This opera cape, although it has a lot of bold and vibrant colors on it, it is a mostly black silk velvet garment. And the music room, if you've not been there before, it can get quite dark. There's not a whole lot of overhead light that's been added to the space since the family lived there. And so I needed a way to have a lighter background so that it really stood out against something. And we have this beautiful built-in display case that usually contains a display of the family's silver collection. And what I ended up doing was taking the silver pieces out of this built-in display case and opted to put the opera cape on view in this. And I really love the way that it just popped so well in this exhibit area against the white background here. So opera was and still is a popular form of entertainment for many in the 20th century. And having grown up in New York City, Florence was accustomed to attending entertainment and cultural events like these as a young girl, and this continued to be a pastime that she and her sister Grace enjoyed into their adult life. This black silk velvet opera cape from the 1920s is made of multicolored sections of pieced velvet and features a stylized floral design. It's a stunning garment that represents a very chic, elegant sense of style and flair of the woman who started it all for the Hermitage organization. It's a wonderful example of the way in which modernism impacted design in the early 20th century in America. The pattern is simplified, but still expressive. It features a stylized pattern of bold, solid color fields to create a design of leaves and fruit. Florence's embrace of the style is noteworthy because it's a quite modern design. And it's a reflection of the way in which Florence was influenced by the world around her, and a striking testament to the larger trends of utilizing bold, vibrant colors and a variety of different designs, which emerged in women's fashion in the 1920s. To complete the space and highlight Florence's love of music, I pulled original opera programs from our archive that once belonged to Florence and her sister Grace. And these were the perfect visual pairing to the stunning opera cape in the case. When you first entered the room, I staged another garment at the end of the hall as a way to pull you into the space, with the idea that maybe you imagine Florence waiting for you in the music room after dinner one evening, and you would wait for her to take a seat at the piano where she would play. I chose this gorgeous rose-colored silk velvet gown from the 1930s to feature in this way. It featured a unique medieval revival inspired design to it. If you see a little closely on the waistline here, there's this beautiful braided detail of the fabric that just creates this gorgeous waist belt, and it's connected to what looks like almost like a little cape as well. So I refer to this one as sort of the Maid Marian dress. Personally, it reminded me so much of maybe Robin Hood. It has a gorgeous feminine design to it. The lines of it are hugging the hips and the waistline. And additionally, you can't really see it in this image here, but there are beautifully hand-painted floral details that are done with a stencil and have a metallic paint quality to them. So there's a really lovely amount of detail to this dress. Now, because I had moved the silver from this room and I moved it elsewhere into the dining room, I had an empty case beside this garment. And so what I did was I pulled a pair of opera glasses from object storage. And these were a pair of opera glasses that Florence had purchased in the 1920s, 1923 specifically. And these were such an adorable, they're so small in scale, you can't really see from this image, but they're so small, and the designs on them and the patterns on them, the detail is just incredible. The surface is decorated intricately with painted enamels, and there are tiny pearls that are inset around the edges. Florence purchased them because they once belonged to Queen Margherita of Savoy, who was the wife of King Umberto I of Italy, and they reigned together until 1900. So this quickly became one of my favorite aspects of the installation of this room. Aside from the gorgeous garments on view, if you peered through the petite little binoculars from the edge of the case that they were in, you could actually see across the room to the other end where the opera case was located. Additionally, my wonderful colleague, Jennifer Lucy, helped to bring the sounds of the era to life with some audio interactives in this space. Through strategically placed audio spots, visitors could be immersed in the room filled with music of past decades with the press of a button, which was a really fun little touch. Next, the exhibition led you down the halls and into the heavily Tudor-inspired dining room. But before you entered the dining room, I chose a striking 1920s dress that was truly sculptural and eye-catching from all sides. It had fabulous, sumptuous details, and it fit well against an otherwise dark wood-paneled space. This dress featured fabrics of lame and lace. There were stunning bright blue and gold colors. It had iridescent and luxurious silk velvet textures as well. And it featured an interesting mix of lace and very modern, chic, woven fabric patterns. It had such unique character and detail throughout it, and it was so unique and fun that it had to be front and center somewhere. From the back, it featured these intriguing folded details of the silk velvet, and you'll see that the blue color just barely peeks out. It's almost like a little visual tease. There's also a slight gradient effect of the gold. You'll see that the gold and the blue sort of mixes together here, almost creating an ombre effect. The detail image of the back really highlights this rather exotic look to the pattern of the woven fabric. And it reminded me so much of maybe a safari or some other wild animal print. And so when I came across this peacock fan from object storage, I just knew that I had to pair these together. And the color, the cobalt blue of the peacock fan just really brought out all the beautiful detail in this dress. Now, the dining room typically features a very dark wood interior with very little overhead light to work with. And so the garments that I chose to highlight inside the dining room had to be bold splashes of color, like the one outside the door. And I really wanted to choose colors that would do well against these dark brown walls and the heavy use of blue textiles in the original space. Blue seems to have been a favorite color of Florence Sloane. In fact, the Persian rug that you see on the ground in this room was specially ordered for her by her husband, William, and done in a blue color rather than its traditional color of red. The velvet seat cushions in the space correspond perfectly with this color scheme, so you know that it's intentional. I chose this lovely bright yellow dinner dress to lead you into the space from the doorway. This is a yellow Georgette silk dinner dress with beige machine-made lace dating to about 1925. And it represents a major transition in the development of fashion in the 1920s. And this was the decreased necessity for several wardrobe changes in one day or for various occasions, which paved the way for a new style of dress that emerged that was fashionable, but also practical and quite modern. And this is the shift dress. The shift dress was simple in its design and embraced a shorter hemline that was so typical of 1920s fashion. But the benefit of it was that it could easily be worn during several occasions throughout the day. This vibrant yellow Georgette silk and beige lace dress was the perfect choice for dinners and for entertaining in the 20s. It was a little fun, a little flirty, a bit sassy, and also retained a bit of the traditional details with the lace overlay. The color was also a gorgeous contrast to the blue Persian rug. Now, I had a number of gowns from the 1930s to highlight throughout the entire exhibition, but I knew exactly which one I had envisioned Florence Sloane wearing in the dining room space. Although this long 1930s gown is made mostly of a dark brown silk velvet, the bright orange chiffon fabric sash is what captivated me about it and led me to believe that it would be just perfect in the dining room space. This gown features the fabric lines on it are done on a bias cut. And so the gown really hugs the waist and the hips. And there's also a little bit of glitz and glam that's added with the addition of a lavish rhinestone accessory on the left-hand side of the waist. If you can kind of see it from this image, it's just right over here next to the chiffon sash. And overall, it's a really glamorous feeling that echoes many of the dress trends that emerged throughout the 1930s. And this is because evening attire in the 1930s was especially inspired by the rise of Hollywood movie stars of the era. Photographs of actors and actresses were printed in media and on the big screen. As Hollywood entered its golden age, costume design departments were at the core of every major studio. Major fashion designers, such as Madeleine Vianney, popularized an ideal of feminine elegance that was inspired by Grecian drapery styles. So evening gowns from the 1930s often featured slinky materials that clung to the female body and cascaded down in a way that mimicked ancient Greek sculpture, like we see here, and in many others from our collection from this decade. Can't really see it in the background here, but there is a portrait, that portrait done by her artist friend Douglas Volk from 1924. I did stage this behind the garment so that visually it corresponded with the interesting sort of bohemian dress that she seems to wear in her portrait with an actual dress from the 1930s that she would have worn. And the color combinations really spoke to each other, which was nice to kind of pick up on those bold color choices. Together, these two garments offer a good example of what was more formal evening attire that she might have worn, and also maybe the more fun and kind of casual dinner dress she might have worn if she had invited you over for dinner in her home. For over a decade, the Great Hall has been home to a concentrated display of East Asian objects from our permanent collection. And there's a great deal of emphasis specifically on the arts of China from the Neolithic times to the last imperial dynasty, which ended in the early 20th century. For this display, I veered from my plans a bit and I made an unusual exception. I actually opted to showcase a garment that Florence did not likely wear herself, but it had an interesting story and it served as a wonderful example of modern fashions from China. So I was happy to include it. And I did so because it was a beautiful textile addition to the space. While Florence was a connoisseur of Asian art in her lifetime, we were not able to find strong influences of any Asian-inspired clothing that she actually wore. So this was as close as we could get. And it created a beautiful visual connection between the fashions represented in the garments from our textile collection. And to show it in the Great Hall, I chose this modern Chinese Tangsong. This stunning dress is made of high quality crepe de chine silk and features beautifully detailed embroidery work in vibrant red along the neck, shoulders, and sides. But you can tell by the body type, this was not something that Florence Sloane wore. This piece also had an interesting personal story behind it. The garment was actually given to Florence Sloane as a personal gift from the wife of a Hermitage Auxiliary lecture speaker in 1946. And the Hermitage Auxiliary was actually founded by Florence Sloane to serve as a lecture branch that served the Hermitage Foundation. And so they had a number of speakers come in from the 1940s and even continued on for many, many years after that. So one of the speaker's wives was actually from China, and she personally gifted this dress to Florence, which was a really interesting backstory to it, I felt. Beside it are beautiful antique Chinese cloisonne enamel beads, which were purchased from Ben Simon of Paris in 1926 by Florence. And then they were custom mounted onto the silk cord that you see on it today by Tiffany & Company in New York City. So together, these objects connect the garments and accessories for the exhibition with the permanent collection, which is usually enjoyed in the Great Hall. Their addition to the space engaged us and visitors even further into Mrs. Sloane's interest as an art collector and appreciator of East Asian culture, including modern fashion. This dress comes from about 1946. Now, the back of the home was always kept as a treasured private space until Mrs. Sloane passed in 1953. In the 16 years that Florence remained living at the Hermitage, while it was both a public museum and still her private home, she kept this wing much to herself. And as such, I wanted the master bedroom gallery space to retain much of the personal feeling it would have had when Florence was still alive. To me, it seemed the perfect spot to tie in some of the family garments that Florence would have worn as a child. So, this arrangement included a number of heirloom pieces that must have been passed through the generations and were meaningful and special enough for her to keep after all those years, even after her own children were fully grown. The image on the left is a young girl's cotton underdress with a delicate off white organdy overdress that features details such as trimmed lace and ruched textures. It dates to about the 1880s and would have been a dress that Florence Sloane wore when she was a young girl, perhaps about 8 or 10 years old. And you can almost imagine her traipsing through the streets in old New York City in this outfit, or stopping at one of her favorite places, which was the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Another very sweet item that must have held special memories for Florence is this beige child's frock on the right-hand side. It's made of wool and it's been embroidered in silk and also trimmed with silk fringe all over. It's a really interesting piece. I've never really seen a child's garment that features such a massive fringed cape. It's really fabulous. This one dates to the 1870s and was probably intended for a child, maybe about 3 or 4 years old. So it's likely that Florence or any other family members may have worn this during a special occasion as a toddler. And many years later, in about 1937 or 1939, Florence's only granddaughter was later photographed in it, which was a really sweet memory probably for her. So these sweet little garments are vestiges of the more traditional fashions that Florence would have worn in her childhood before she really had agency over what she could wear. They're also a really great contrast and example of how fashions transformed throughout the decades when she was living. We see a lot of lace, we see a lot of embroidery, we see a lot of silk. Mostly the garments seem to be this off-white or neutral color palette, which was very typical of the time. All in all, the master bedroom felt like the perfect space to highlight these sentimental clothing articles that Florence held on to throughout her life. Just like the master bedroom, the morning room also would have been retained as a private space that Florence used essentially as an extended living room area. She could have done any number of things in this space, including taking tea or reading a good book. And to me, this seemed like a spot where she might have even dabbled with a few sewing projects in her downtime. Florence was certainly a fearless and passionately involved individual in the development of Norfolk's cultural life. And in the quiet spaces of her own home, such as the morning room, she was free to pursue her own creative passions, and she had many. She was very inventive and resourceful, with even the more quote unquote traditional hobbies, such as china painting, sewing, needlepoint, and crocheting. Among the many materials in the museum's textile collections are stacks of scrap fabrics, sewing instruments, and handmade items that were often made and reworked by her. She seems to have often added or remixed accessories and pieces of fabrics to enliven personal clothing items, and especially hats. Activities such as sewing, needlepoint, crocheting, and knitting were all very common tasks for women of the early 20th century. It was certainly a social activity. Women would get together and you could do your needlepoint together while having conversations, but it was also a very practical activity as well. In the days before the production of clothing as we know it today, items could be sent off to a dressmaker for modifications for those who could afford it, but they could more easily be mended or tailored at home if someone possessed the skills. Most young girls grew up learning the basics of sewing as part of their standard education. And during leaner times, particularly through the Great Depression years and times of war, it was very common for American women to take up their sewing kits and rework existing clothing articles rather than purchase whole new outfits for occasions. The garment that I selected for this gallery space is a mid-length, dark brown silk velvet dress from the mid 1920s. Its color palette appears a bit serious and traditional. Additionally, it features a beautifully delicate program of fine lace in an off-white color, which highlights the collar and the sleeve cuffs, and it appears quite antique. But there is a fun addition to the otherwise serious and traditional looking dress, and that's the bright pink silk flower that is attached at the waistline. This adds a smart bit of flair and it's a welcome splash of color. A dress of this type was actually most likely worn during evening dinners. It's considered a dinner dress. But I think it could just as easily have been worn throughout the day, even when Florence was in her downtime working on embroidery or sewing projects of her own. And so, to highlight Florence's own creative skill and appreciation for sewing and this otherwise quote unquote traditional women's work, I supplemented the garment with several personal items from Florence's collection. On the table behind this arrangement is a needlepoint piece that Florence actually made herself while traveling abroad, and it was later framed. There's also a hoard of leftover silk thread that sort of completes this display. Beside the garment, this is one of my favorite aspects as well. Beside the garment, I chose to display one of Florence's own sewing accessory sets. This small personal accessory set was purchased from Tiffany and Company and personalized just for Florence. There's a thimble that's set inside this small little circular cove, and it is engraved with the word birdcatcher and the abbreviation 32, as in 1932, and then the monograms FKS. The strawberry serves as the cutest pin cushion where excess pins could be placed while sewing. And there's a long, narrow object, which is actually a poker, but it's got its own little sheath, which is elaborately decorated and engraved all around it. All three of these accessories are attached onto a gold chain and connected by a jump loop, which could have been easily attached to a lady's accessory belt or garment loop. Prior to the exhibition last year, we had the opportunity to have the dressing rooms plaster moldings restored and repainted so that I could feature a show-stopping dress in this space. And for this space, I chose a garment that also needed to be seen fully in the round because we had these 3-paneled full-length mirrors that are built into the wall at the backside. And so I wanted to showcase a dress where you really needed to see all the details from the full 360-degree range. And I chose this dress because it needed to be seen all the way around. It's an incredible, ultra elegant black chiffon silk dress. It features a floral patterned black silk chiffon overlay on top of a neutral colored slip underneath. The dress was also intricately decorated with a beautiful arrangement of rhinestone and sequin details throughout the front, back, and the sides. So again, you really needed to see all sides to appreciate the details. This dress is another ultra glamorous example from the 1930s, and it's one of the best examples that our collection has of the elegance and emphasis on feminine curves that returned to evening dress fashions in the 1930s. The dress accentuates the hips and waist with the use of the bias cuts. Its lightweight materials add a flowing gossamer quality to the fabric, and this color combination of the black chiffon over a beige colored satin slip creates the illusion of complete sheerness. To add to the effect of the dressing room and how it functioned for Florence, I envisioned it as a space where you could imagine Florence readying herself for a night out in this exquisite garment. And I honestly wonder where she's going. To create this, I staged her personal vanity items, most of which were made by Tiffany and Company of New York, which are seen here on the left-hand side, and I placed them next to the dress on top of the vanity set. Now, a welcome challenge during the installation was that there were just so many wonderful garments to show in the exhibition. I kind of ran out of room in the downstairs spaces. So in addition to the downstairs, I was able to continue to fill the remaining upstairs galleries as well. But the upstairs spaces have a totally different feeling than the historic interiors downstairs and read much more as a modern gallery setting. So this ended up being an opportunity to stage garments in more of a gallery format with a neutral gray background. In these galleries, I grouped many of the garments together, but I also wanted to highlight some of the interesting pairings of fashion with accessories and jewelry that we also had from the collection and that I was able to pull out of object storage. To serve as a point of contrast, I opted to place 2 garments from an earlier time period on view in one of the upstairs rooms. I paired these with a variety of the many antique jewelry items that we had in the collection. This dress on the left-hand side of the slide is an off-white lingerie dress that's made of layers of lightweight cotton and satin panels. It dates to about 1907. This type of dress would have required an S-shaped figure, which was achieved by many women of the era with the assistance of a tightly cinched corset. This type of lightweight sheer dress from the period is known as a lingerie dress, but it's not named because they were necessarily undergarments. Rather, they were heavily decorated gowns that were made of several layers of thin fabrics. Lingerie dresses were worn by various classes of women from the 1900s through the 1920s, and they proved popular, particularly because they were well suited for leisure activities and warmer weather. They were also simple in design and cost effective because they were easy to clean. They could be bought ready to made, and they actually gave instructions in news clippings and also magazines of the time. Or they could be created at home with a pattern, and they could even be pieced together by a dressmaker if you wanted to go that route. The Hermitage has few garments from Florence's wardrobe from this period that are in such good condition, making this one an important piece to display. It was a striking contrast in style to the vibrant and richly decorated garments of later decades, and it also served as a really great connection point to tie in some of our antique jewelry pieces. The image on the upper right shows a lovely set of seed pearl necklace and a matching brooch pin from the 1830s. Tiny pearls, known as seed pearls, were often sewn together with wire to create beautiful, intricate jewelry like you see here. This material was popular in accessories through the turn of the 20th century, but it was not an easy task to make something like this. The pearls were actually drilled by hand, and so there was a high degree and high potential for potential breakage. And these tended to be treasured jewelry pieces that were handed down from generation to generation. This particular set is extremely delicate and exemplifies the fine quality craftsmanship that was required for this kind of work. In the center image, this is a gorgeous pair of Etruscan Revival styled earrings that are made with garnets, and it has a matching brooch pin. This set dates to about the 1870s or 1880s. The Etruscan Revival style was popular in the Victorian period, and this design echoes actual ancient Greek and Roman jewelry styles, which were being discovered during excavations of Pompeii and Herculaneum in Italy in the late 19th century. And Victorian jewelers were looking at these and using them as inspiration to create their own. The garnet stones have been worn and widely admired for decades. They were a favorite material accessory choice, definitely by the 1860s, but they were very popular well into the 1890s. The last image at the lower right features a very sentimental family piece. This is a locket pocket watch from the 19th century. Inside it are photographs of a young adult man and a young girl. The girl is Florence Sloane as a young child. The man depicted may have been her father, who had died in 1884 when Florence was just 11 years old, or it might have been a brother of hers. This makes for such a sweet personal addition to the gallery. I did use one of the upstairs spaces to group together a variety of dresses from the 1920s. And so this room could be described as bold, playful, and free-spirited. In the 1920s, the world of jazz music transformed everything in a post-war society. Its fast-paced rhythms, wandering melodies reflected a society that was rapidly in flux. As fashion historians have noted, the devil-may-care attitude of the jazz age dramatically influenced fashions of the day. For women, dresses became more revealing and silhouettes became linear. Waistlines dropped and oftentimes even disappeared. Hemlines and hair became shorter. Designs were often simplified and sleek, but there was still the use of extensive beading and fringe and materials that glittered in the night. Two of my favorite dresses from this gallery are two little black dresses. The dress on the left is a heavily beaded black flapper style dress from the 1920s. It is made of silk and glass beads. Classic flapper dresses such as this are usually made of these heavy beaded details on sheer fabric. And this was a process that could only be achieved by hand. Although machines could do this faster, the haute couture houses of France made these exquisite beaded embroideries by hand. There was a special technique for it. And the garments often became so that they were on full panels. They were produced by full panels, and then these panels could be cut up into different sections, and they could be imported, exported out, and sent off to local dressmakers who could then customize pieces for individual clients. And these pieces are absolutely gorgeous, but they are somewhat problematic because they result in very heavy garments, because there's so much elaborate beaded details that are used. And they're often on a very sheer silk fabric ground, which results in very fragile garments. So they are prone to irreparable tears due to the extreme stress and weight of the beaded details, and bead loss is very common. And also beads are often stitched continuously together. And so if a thread becomes loose, don't pull it. It can often result in the whole strain becoming undone. Now, Florence was not a true flapper woman. She was a mature mother of 2 grown sons and in her late 40s in the 1920s. Flapper was a term that usually had a negative association during the era. It often described a young, modern woman who flouted her disdain for social conventions. She openly drank alcohol during Prohibition and went out to dance halls as independently and freely as men of the era. Flappers were actually considered scandalous. So Florence was not the exact definition of a flapper, but her embrace and acceptance of a style of fashion, despite its negative association with the flapper woman, who was often criticized and harshly judged for being young, free, and liberated, is noteworthy. Perhaps this suggests an openness and even bohemian outlook that Florence may have had with changing times. Another black dress worth mentioning is this long sleeved garment made of black silk, and then it's trimmed at the bottom with horizontal bands of black silk velvet. This elegant black dress is one of few from Florence's garment collection that actually has a maker's tag. Underneath the interior of the skirt is a House of Worth label. House of Worth is that of Charles Frederick Worth. He was an English entrepreneur and dressmaker, but he's also credited as the father of haute couture, and his name is synonymous with high quality fashion. After his death in 1895, his sons embraced changing fashion trends of the 20th century and carried on the fashion house reputation until the mid 1920s, until they passed. And then after them, Worth's great grandson continued the family business until 1952. But by that point, the business was considered past its heyday. Regardless, this garment's elegant lines, very unique, wide, and flaring sleeves, and intricate silk velvet details are a testament to the level of expert craftsmanship of the designer and the dressmaker. It's quite a fashion forward piece, and it's a beautiful example of the high quality fashion that a woman of style and means may have worn in this decade. Additional garments on view in this gallery featured shimmering displays that were made with a modern material, lame. Lame fabrics were woven with either natural or synthetic materials to create the look of glittering clothing, and it was especially a popular choice in the 1920s for evening wear. Florence's wardrobe from this decade, at the least, certainly shows an appreciation for the variety of new materials and designs of the 1920s. It shows that she accepted some of these changes of the decade and adopted its dazzling modern designs, but she also probably modified and chose elements that resonated with her own personal sense of style and her body type. Remember that she was a Victorian woman. She grew up wearing a corset for much of her life. So the style and the design of many of the very linear, waistless 1920s dresses, she probably had some wiggle room there. In the last gallery, I paired dresses with accessories. Florence drew from many inspirations and sources. She was well-read, traveled throughout Europe, and was an avid connoisseur of art. She stayed up to date with many trends and styles of her day. And like many wealthy women of her time, she had most things customized, or she purchased things that were of her specific taste. Throughout it all, we see that Florence admired the antique, the handcrafted, and the eclectic well into the 1930s. To highlight this world of many influences and interests, I added additional displays of accessories to clothing on view. Accessories were an important part of a woman's wardrobe and often included things like gloves, hats, and purses. Among the accessories I wanted to feature were a selection of hats that still survive. The one on the far left side, the navy blue velvet hat with black egret feathers, has a label inside of it. It is from Thurn, Paris, and New York. The one above it is a green felt feathered hat, and there is a label stitched inside this one from a local store. This was from Florence Wilson of Norfolk, Virginia. The hat over here is made of black horsehair. It dates to about the 1950s. And at the very end, the far right side here, there's a summer hat that's made of straw, and it has details of embroidered net and purple velvet flowers. So you can see this paired with maybe a summer garment. Additionally, there were several antique and modern purses or handbags in the collection that were unique and interesting. Everything from intricately beaded, pet-a-point, silk, and handcrafted French leather, all in all spanning from about the 1830s to the 1920s. The following pairings in the third gallery upstairs suggested a visual connection between the selected garment and specific antique and modern pieces from the jewelry collection. For instance, next to this beautiful and vibrant summer gown from the 1930s, I paired it with an arrangement of vibrant jewelry pieces. This one is a gold and enamel pendant in the center. The enameled gold pendant features a design of two flamingos whose necks intertwine. And this would have been mounted onto a long silk cord initially, but it has since deteriorated and detached. And the piece is a French enameled piece, but it was purchased from Tiffany and Company by Florence in 1923. Together, I felt that the bright colors and the lighthearted feeling of these items would have made an interesting pairing, and I could have easily seen Florence wearing these together, maybe at a garden party. Also in this gallery, I combined several antique Scottish jewelry pieces with a very fun Scottish-inspired dress from the 1920s. On the left is a Victorian-era Scottish dirk pin. The dirk is essentially stylized daggers, and these would have been pinned onto quilts. The stones are likely a cairngorm, citrine stone, which is a variety native to Scotland. The pin also features tiers of colorful agate in green, blue, and reddish orange. In the Victorian era, Queen Victoria loved Scotland and all things Scottish inspired. This drove a market and desire for all things Scottish in terms of fashion and accessories as early as 1851. Brooches and pins were by far the most popular form of Scottish jewelry. Another lovely Scottish-inspired piece is this cloak fastener with precious stones. These type of pins were also called annular brooches, named for the Latin that describes their circular shape. Again, Queen Victoria loved Scotland, and these were very popular in the Victorian era. The stones at the top are citrine, the red is garnet, and there are additional quartz, cabochon, yellow cairngorm, and purple amethyst elsewhere around the cloak pin. Paired with these lovely pieces was a very fun, flirty, and stylish silk velvet Tattersall plaid day dress from the 1920s. It featured a smart-looking scarf that was attached to the neckline and the sleeves, the cuff of the sleeves. This dress also featured lovely stitchwork and details along the torso. I could easily see Florence Sloane taking on city officials in this dress with a pair of Oxford heels. Finally, this gold lame and black brocade dress with a silk velvet skirt and sleeve cuffs from the early 1920s was paired with a lovely set of antique Spanish jewelry. The Spanish jewelry pieces, a necklace and coordinating pendant brooch, featured beads that were washed in gold and metal work that contained an incredibly detailed setting of green stones and pearls. The necklace was actually gifted to Florence Sloane from a widely respected Spanish antiques dealer named Arthur Bin, whom she had met and interacted with during her travels to Spain in 1927. Taking the exhibition as a whole, the fashions reveal the individual who wore them and also showcase her clothing throughout the eras. What we see is bold, vibrant, and a playful spirit that comes through many items. There's surely a love and appreciation for details, craftsmanship, and feminine beauty. There's quite the mixture of the antique, the modern, the personal, and the worldly that she seems to have held on to. So her wardrobe, like her life, seems to reflect a world of influences. To create the exhibition, we pulled archival materials, additional personal items that have been kept in object storage, and really strived to bring together a display of items that reflected the many facets of this powerfully inspiring female founder of ours. If you would like information about specific pieces from the exhibition, please check out our virtual Museum from Home portal from the Visit tab of the Hermitage Museum's website. We've uploaded dozens of individual videos about specific garments that were on view during the exhibition. And I hope that it can be enjoyed as a resource if you were not able to see the exhibition in person. And lastly, I just want to thank everyone who was part of this project and who helped make it such a special experience. As I mentioned before, this one truly took a village, and we learned so much throughout the process. And we were able to highlight so many objects from storage in our collection that I was really just happy to be able to work on. And also that we created this visual record, and now we can use these photographs of the collections for years to come. So thank you so much, Peggy, for inviting me to be part of this virtual lecture series. I'm so happy to be talking about Florence Sloane and all of her contributions to the city of Norfolk this month for Women's History Month. And if there are any questions, I am happy to take them.
Thank you, Lindsay. That was so great. I feel like I had a special guide for the tour of the
Good.
garments. That was just fabulous. I can't believe that she was able to keep all of those things, and she was such a tiny little person and such a mighty,
Yes.
mighty woman. Does anyone have questions? If not, I would like to invite you all to come back next month on April 14th. That will be our next program. We don't have a speaker yet, but we're working on it. It will be wonderful. It's going to be hard to top this one. But thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Lindsay. Really, really learned a lot. And oh, what beautiful clothes. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the week. Stay safe.
Thank you and good night.
Good night.